Good afternoon or morning, depending on where you're tuning in from. And thank you all for joining us for day 2 of our Transit Cost and Project Delivery Symposium. My name is Ron McAvaz, and I'm a policy analyst here at the Eno Center for Transportation. And today we are having one of our 3 concurrent peer research presentations with Dr. Carol Voulgaris. Dr. Voulgaris is an assistant professor of urban planning at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. And today she will discuss differences in cost and ridership forecasting and present findings on the relationship between the accuracy of ridership forecasts and that of cost estimates for fixed guideway transit projects funded by the FTA's New Starts program. As a reminder, we will have a 30-minute break after this 1-hour session, and then we will have an afternoon panel consisting of representatives from the Eno, NYU, Berkeley Law, and Spur research teams to discuss findings from our respective projects investigating transit project delivery. All of these sessions will be recorded and posted on Socio after they are over, so you'll still be able to go in and access sessions that you weren't able to attend, particularly for these concurrent sessions that we'll be having over the next couple of days. You'll be able to, as a reminder, access all of the sessions on the agenda tab to the left of your screen on Socio. And at the end of this session and all future sessions, you'll be prompted to rate and evaluate this panel. And your feedback is really important to us and to the presenters. So please take the time to offer comments and rate each session once you are finished watching. And in the afternoon, just as we did yesterday, we will have a Zoom networking lounge open to meet and greet and get to know one another. And if any of the presenters are around, you'll be able to stick around and get to know each of them and ask questions just to the moderators and presenters about the peer research sessions that we have today. So again, we are very excited to welcome Dr. Voulgaris to present her work. And I'll hand it over to Dr. Voulgaris to present her work, and I will come back on screen at the end of her presentation to moderate a discussion about these findings. As a reminder, you can submit your questions in the chat box that you see on your screen, and we will get to as many as we can at the end of this session. So with that said, I will take myself off screen and hand it over to Dr. Voulgaris. Thank you again for joining us.
Hi, thanks for having me, and thank you for that introduction. I'm pleased to be here today. It has been a pleasure I got to serve on the kind of advisory board for the Eno Transit Cost project, and really enjoyed hearing about the great work that they're doing. And it relates in one way to this this work that I'll be talking about today, which I'm going to describe as sort of a work in progress. In the sense that I have some results, but it's a topic that I continue to think about. And it's a question more about not how much transit projects, the difference between how much transit projects do cost and how much we think they should cost. And to the extent that a project is completed over budget, is that a failure in cost estimation, or is that a failure in project management, or a failure to stay within the budget? Is it the budget that was wrong? Was it the ultimate cost that was wrong? And how do those pieces fit together? I want to spend the particular, I guess, case study kind of sample that I'm thinking about this project in terms of is federally funded fixed guideway transit projects in the United States, and those are projects that are funded by the Federal Transit Administration's New Starts program. I think I don't know enough about sort of the background of who's in this room today. I think there's probably various levels of familiarity with federal transit funding programs. So I'll briefly introduce what that program is, and then talk a little bit about optimism bias in prediction, both predicting the costs of new transit projects and the demand for those projects, or the benefits of those projects, basically the future ridership of those projects. It's common to talk about, when we talk about cost optimism bias, it's common to talk about the errors in ridership forecasting and cost estimation sort of together. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about how these two activities are different, estimating the cost of a project and evaluating cost estimation accuracy, how that differs from similar conversations around ridership forecast accuracy. And then I'll present what I'm going to describe as preliminary results on some of the relationships between the errors we observe in cost forecast or cost estimation and in ridership forecast. So starting out, just introducing the New Starts program. That's kind of the maybe colloquial term in one sense for sort of a broader program that's the Capital Improvement Grants program, which is the primary grant program that the Federal Transit Administration uses to assist local transit agencies in funding fixed guideway transit projects, which I could just say that's rail transit, although it also would include non-rail modes like bus rapid transit. So it's any transit that operates in its own separate right-of-way. In determining which projects to fund through this grants program, it's a discretionary grant program, which means the Federal Transit Administration can choose which projects it will make grants to. And a big part of that selection is based on evaluations of the cost effectiveness of proposed projects, where cost effectiveness is a ratio of cost to benefits. And historically and currently, the costs that are considered in that cost effectiveness calculations are financial costs, capital costs, the cost of actually building, constructing the project. And the benefits have always been some kind of estimation or some function of an estimate of how many people are going to be riding the project in the future. This has been controversial at times, that this is the basis by which we should select projects. And in fact, I'm not going to go over this whole timeline in detail. I might sit on it for a while I talk about it, and you can read through this. But sort of in the history of federal investment in public transit, the role that cost effectiveness has played. So beginning in about 1976, when really this program of federal investment in local transit projects sort of began, there was this idea that cost effectiveness should be a primary selection criterion. And then the definition of cost effectiveness has changed somewhat over time in terms of exactly what types of costs are included, and especially how we think of benefits. Is it total ridership? Is it incremental ridership? Cost compared to what? Do we compare it to an alternative? There was a brief period of time when we also considered this combination of increases in ridership and travel time savings as an estimate of like total consumer surplus resulting from a project. And there's also been sort of this push and pull, typically between the executive branch of the government and the legislative branch of our government, in terms of how much we should be evaluating projects purely in terms of cost and ridership, and how much other project evaluation criteria should be considered, and how much those different project evaluation criteria should be weighted. So cost effectiveness has always been a big part of how projects are selected, but it has rarely been the only consideration. And because of that, the importance of cost estimates and ridership forecasts in selecting which projects ultimately get built has varied over time. When we're making these sometimes substantial investments in infrastructure based on estimates of how much it will cost to build a project in the future and how many people will ride a project in the future, there's always going to be uncertainty associated with predicting the future. And history has shown that the errors that have been made have had a pattern to them, have maybe been overly optimistic. Projects tend to cost more than we expect them to, and tend not to generate as much ridership as we claim they will when we're applying for federal funding. There have been some explanations for why we see this bias. Some of those has focused on sort of technical and project-specific characteristics. And the answer to those, the response to those explanations would be, we need better models, we need better methods, we need more oversight in how we create these cost estimates or these ridership forecasts. Because if we're focusing on the methods that were used or the assumptions that went into them, then we really do need to think about ridership forecasts and cost estimates very differently, because the process for creating a ridership forecast is quite different than the process of creating a cost estimate. But there are also these systemic explanations that have been proposed or pointed out that are more along the lines of like psychological biases and also like ethical considerations. Strategic misrepresentation is something that particularly Bent Floberg famously has focused on, this idea that the errors we observe are not errors in the sense that they're mistakes. These are lies. This idea that transit agencies are intentionally misrepresenting how much a project will cost and what the demand is because they want to get that federal funding for it. A less sort of more innocuous explanation is that people really genuinely do believe that projects will cost less than what they ultimately end up costing because we're just optimistic people. It's difficult for us to anticipate the things that will go wrong in the future, and every disaster and every setback is ultimately unexpected, and we don't adequately account for the fact that, you know, the bad thing that happens to set us back, we don't know what it's going to be, but there's always something. So we're not adequately including, you know, margins of errors and contingencies in our estimates. So these type of systemic explanations, these could apply equally well, potentially, to ridership forecasts and cost estimates. There's also, I put this under the category of like defensible explanations for error. We know that we can't predict the future perfectly. Okay, all forecasts, all estimates, all statements about the future should have noise about them. We can't expect them to be perfectly accurate. The accusations or, you know, speculation about maybe there's something unethical going around here is the fact not just that we have inaccuracy, but that we have bias. So that if we were just like sometimes wrong about predicting the future, we should be overestimating ridership as often as we're underestimating ridership. We should be overestimating costs as often as we underestimate costs. And the fact that there's this bias in an optimistic direction maybe proves that there's some larger kind of systemic, whether that's a psychological optimism that needs to be somehow tamped down, or whether that's an ethical thing that's happening where people are misrepresenting projects to represent them more favorably than they know is real, then we wouldn't see this bias. In fact, there is some selection bias at work here. So the idea that we should expect to have no bias in our observed accuracy of cost estimates and ridership forecasts falls apart a little bit, because there are forecasts that are produced, presumably, and I'll use forecast to refer both to ridership forecasts and to cost estimates. So calculations, estimates about the future that we never know if those turn out to have been accurate because those projects don't get built. So the project that we thought was going to cost, you know, X number of billions of dollars, but ultimately would have cost half of what we thought it ultimately did. That project doesn't ever get built because the cost estimate was so high. So as soon as, and that's what this graphic illustrates, this idea that when we don't ever observe the actual value for estimates that aren't optimistic enough, or that, you know, ridership values that aren't high enough, or cost estimates that aren't low enough. And so as soon as the cost estimate or the ridership forecast itself is one of the determinants of whether a project gets built, you would expect to see at least some level of bias in the observed data. How much bias is okay, how accurate we need to be to say we don't have a problem, is a question, you know, for further discussion and debate. So this is the part that sort of applies to both this conversation we can have together about both cost estimates and ridership forecasts. And the initial kind of research project some of this analysis I'll be talking about came out of did consider cost estimates and ridership forecasts together. I did end up publishing some of the work in journals on ridership forecasting, and sort of held back, and I'm kind of continuing to work on the cost estimation piece because of some of these differences. I don't necessarily think you can talk about both of these things together. Some of this is, even if we think about like the ethics of misrepresenting the benefits and costs of a project, the incentives are slightly different for ridership forecasts than for cost forecasts. You know, in this kind of theoretical world where you can get away with anything, and, you know, there's no consequence of having been, you know, consistently producing inaccurate forecasts, the incentives for ridership forecasts could be to just predict ridership as high as possible, to like really overstate the benefits, It's not quite the same for cost estimates, right? So you don't want to ridership forecast for cost estimates. You don't want to claim that a project can be completed for no cost or for zero cost or for, you know, a couple of dollars, because ultimately you want to make the case that you need money to complete the project. So you do want the project to be low enough that it looks like a good investment, that there's going to be this return on an investment, but you want the cost estimate to be high enough that you can justify getting a federal grant to start building the project. So the incentives would have sort of a moderating effect on any kind of strategic error in an initial estimate. There's also just a difference in the process by which these two types of estimates or forecasts are prepared. So for ridership forecasts, those are prepared through most often through travel demand models. Those models are developed primarily by transportation engineers. The models might be run by a different person who developed them. They tend to be these very complex, multi-stepped quantitative models that describe all travel within a region. The model, again, would be developed by an engineer, possibly run by an engineer or a planner with some technical training. Although the models are very complex, like the math that's involved in the running of the model, to the point where they can be viewed as a little bit of a black box, the basic model structure, so this idea that these are four-step models, for example, that predict trip generation and then trip distribution, kind of this understanding of how travel behavior works and how travel is distributed throughout a system, it's a fairly common part of a transportation planner or transportation engineer's education. So even if your typical transportation planner might not be able to develop, to build or run one of these regional travel demand models from scratch, because they are computationally intensive and very technical and complex, they sort of know some of the right questions to ask, what pieces are involved, that they're sort of grounded in theories of travel behavior. This is well within the domain of planning these types of questions. And so transportation planning and transportation engineering. But because the models themselves are so complex, there's actually, I'm going to make this statement, that there's minimal oversight by the Federal Transit Administration, in the sense that historically you haven't had staff from the FTA or hired by the FTA examining the nuts and bolts of a travel demand model that was used to produce a particular ridership forecast. In contrast, for cost estimation, it's a different set of professionals that's going to be developing those cost estimates. So the individual person, the human who is creating these estimates, is not the same person who's running the travel demand model. This seems almost axiomatic, but cost estimates are likely to be developed by cost estimators, who might be people with a background in construction management, construction engineering. In many cases, the travel demand modeler and the cost estimator might both at some level have been trained as civil engineers, but fairly different specializations within civil engineering. Cost estimation techniques are not necessarily going to be a standard part of a transportation planner's or even like a transportation engineer's education. The person preparing the travel demand forecast may not have the skills or the knowledge to prepare a cost estimate. But there is a relatively high level of oversight from the Federal Transit Administration. There's a project management consultant that kind of assists in the preparation, or at least oversees the preparation of cost estimates, and will check in during the project development period, to make sure that cost estimates continue to be realistic. These are much simpler, like the calculation techniques for developing a cost estimate. This is going to be like a spreadsheet model rather than kind of a standalone complex numerical model that's meant to capture all the travel that happens within a city. And that allows for a higher level of guidance and oversight from the Federal Transit Administration. There's also a difference here about kind of, the way I'll describe this is just a difference in perceptions of control. So what is seen as being within the project sponsor's control, and what is seen as being beyond the project sponsor's control? And this is mostly kind of based on conversations I've had. This isn't like a research-based table. These are sort of initial thoughts, and I actually welcome comments from the audience about how these things differ. But For ridership forecasts, the forecast is seen as being very much within the control of the project sponsor, and those who run these models, even in some cases, well, this is based on kind of research and conversations, formal interviews I've had with folks in this space. There's this idea that it's important for the person preparing forecasts to have a strong sense of ethics, because it's fairly easy to manipulate a ridership forecast to create a desirable outcome if you need to. I don't necessarily have the sense that there's that same sense of control over what a cost estimate has, that a cost estimate feels more like, or is seen more like a measurement than kind of a blue sky kind of forecasting exercise. That said, once the project opens, observed ridership is seen as being just sort of this external thing that happens. It is true that transit agencies can take some actions to try to increase ridership on a project after it opens, through fare policy and through marketing, even through kind of redesigning the network around a new transit line. But when we talk about ridership forecast accuracy, we tend to think of that as being, we're predicting this thing that happens, and the thing that we're predicting is sort of beyond our control. This is different than how we talk about cost estimate accuracy, because not so much once the project opens, but at least once construction starts, the cost estimation exercise is over. But there's this idea that the project sponsor can still control costs through good project management. So where the cost estimation exercise feels a little bit more like measurement and a little bit less like making guesses about the future, controlling costs and keeping costs within that budget is still something that may be perceived as being within the project sponsor's control, which gets to, again, this idea of, which I'll return to that in a minute, but temporal variation in what it is we're predicting versus what we're measuring. For ridership forecasts, it's common for a ridership forecast to be prepared somewhat early in the project development time period. And it would be unusual for that forecast to change very much as the project continues to go through development and engineering and design. In fact, if the ridership forecast does change, it's usually because the project has changed. You know, if a proposed stop has been moved, or if the line has moved to a parallel corridor. If the ridership forecast changed, there's a question of whether we're even still talking about the same project anymore, though. So there's opportunities when a project gets evaluated at different milestones to change the ridership forecast. But for the most part, the forecast is going to be constant throughout. Once the project opens, though, ridership varies from one day to the next. And definitely over time, year over year, so when we say, was the project forecast accurate, there's this question of, well, to what point? So if the project opens here, we have no variation in the forecast, but then a lot of variation in actual ridership once the project opens. This is in contrast to cost estimates, where early in project development, a particular cost might be estimated. And then as we continue to learn more about land acquisition costs, as we continue to design the project and start to refine those designs and plans, the cost estimate itself should bounce around a little bit as we get more information about what's going to be involved in building this project, as we get more detail about what the project is even going to be. Once the project opens, though, the construction cost, the capital cost is final at some point. Again, looking at this as project opening, this might even be, when construction begins, this project cost goes, this looks like an example of a project that finished under budget, right? Where we thought it would cost right before it opened, turned out to be a little bit more than what it was. But the variation in cost estimate happens before the project opens, but the actual cost is not nearly as complicated to nail down or define. Which brings up this question when we talk about the accuracy of cost estimates or of ridership forecasts. A question you have to address with ridership forecasts is, what's the actual value? What's the observed ridership value you want to compare the forecast to? The current policy of the Federal Transit Administration, as they require project sponsors to prepare before and after studies to kind of verify their own accuracy, is that they compare forecast ridership to the ridership 2 years after a project opens. some work that I completed a couple years ago with a master's student of mine at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo suggests that 2 years time period is probably about right, that ridership probably hits something like a steady state 1 or 2 years after a project opens, but it might vary a lot in the initial couple of years. For cost estimates, this question of what time in the future to compare it to, like the cost estimate doesn't bounce around anymore once a project has opened. But because the cost estimate itself varies over the course of project development, there's this question of which cost estimate are we most interested in the accuracy of? Is it the first estimate when a project sponsor first approached the Federal Transit Administration for funding? Is it the cost estimate that was kind of on the books and there like around the time construction begins? You sometimes see, I've got this image of the power broker, the biography of Robert Moses, and there's sort of these are quotations on back-to-back pages, this idea that once the initial expenditure has been authorized, it's hard to go back. So once we started even spending money on designing a project, for example, you don't want to waste that money. So an overly optimistic initial cost estimate could still cause problems and could incentivize like further wasted resources. But then on the kind of a paragraph earlier than that, we see that what's really a problem maybe is once construction begins, that's really the point of no return. You can abandon a project if costs have escalated over the course of designing, but it's really once there's stakes in the ground that you're sort of tied and committed, and cost overruns, you just have to find the money to pay for that. And so this is where I want to talk about the difference between cost escalation and cost overruns, and sort of who gets blamed and how we might explain the differences or explain both of these things in a different way. Cost escalation is the increases in project costs that happen over the course of project development. So using a similar graphic to this one, cost escalation would be initially we thought the project would be at this low level, and then we realized it would cost a little bit more, and then we did some value engineering and we found out we could do it a little cheaper, and we realized that, well, no, we couldn't. And so this is what we thought the cost would be at the time we began construction. Then we start running into cost overruns, which are increases in project costs after construction begins. And so this is a project that the cost escalated somewhat over the course of project development, but then there was also this cost overrun where it was completed over budget. A project could be completed under budget, but the budget might increase a lot over the course of project development. And there's a question of which of those things is a bigger problem? What's the question we're really interested in? What are we concerned with? And can we explain both pieces of the difference between our initial cost estimate and the final cost? Is there a common explanation for both of those things? So having kind of given some of that framing and background, I want to get into sort of what we see in the data for a set of projects that were funded through the New Starts program. These are projects that opened over a period of about 20 years or so, between 1989 and 2011. And these are projects where we have the ridership forecast and the initial cost estimate and the final cost estimate for this set of 50 projects. And if we look at the ones for which ridership was overestimated, that is the majority of these 50 projects, about 80% of these projects. But of the projects where ridership was overestimated, less than half of those actually were optimistic, so underestimated costs for both the initial cost estimate and the final cost estimate. And we actually see much less bias in the final cost estimate. So of these 50 projects, 24 of them finished under budget, and 26 of them finished over budget. And then, of those projects that were over budget, I wouldn't say over, they're over budget for the final cost estimate. 22 of them, so most of those also had an overly optimistic initial cost estimate. But a few of them, the initial cost estimate was actually conservative. And so there's not this one-to-one correspondence. We can also kind of look at this with slightly more nuance by looking at the degree to which a ridership forecast or a cost estimate, how much error there was in relation to the observed value. And that's what we see here. So, and I'm calculating error here kind of an unconventional way, but it's to make the correlation analysis work better where it's symmetrical. But it's the difference between the predicted and observed value divided by the average of those two values. And what we see is the errors for ridership here do not have a statistically significant correlation with the errors we see for cost estimates, but there is a significant correlation between the error for the initial cost estimate and the error for the final cost estimate. So how optimistic an estimate was for ridership doesn't seem to have a strong correlation with how optimistic the cost estimate was, but an overly optimistic initial cost estimate may have the effect of anchoring future cost estimates so that those also turn out to have been optimistic. We can look at how these values change over time. And so here's sort of plotted on a graph and like a trend line fitted to those. I've indicated what you can maybe ignore these categories, but I have indicated what was the surface transportation authorization that was in effect at the time. But we see for our ridership cost estimates, there's a negative correlation between the year the forecast that was prepared and how was prepared and how accurate it turns out to have been, which means this is all really good news. Ridership forecasts are getting more accurate over time. Initial cost estimates, we also see a positive correlation. Again, it's good. Like we want the error to be conservative, so they're getting. The fact that these relations are in opposite direction is what we'd expect to see. So this is that we're overestimating ridership less and we're underestimating costs less over time. So we're getting more accurate both over time for both of these. There is not a statistically significant correlation between the accuracy of the final cost estimate and its error, but some of that is because the final cost estimates, as I showed, up here, were actually pretty unbiased and pretty accurate, where the median error was like less than a percentage point for those final cost estimates. Looking at sort of the relationship between when the estimate was prepared and how much longer it took to develop the project, with the idea that it's harder to predict things that happen further in the future, there wasn't a relationship between how much time there was remaining until until project construction began for how accurate a ridership forecast was, or one of those early cost estimates was. But if you look at the last cost estimate that was prepared for a project, there was a negative relationship between accuracy and how much more time elapsed before construction began. That may be because preparing a final cost estimate and not beginning construction immediately is a sign that there's something else going on, that there might be something wrong. Of the 59 projects where in this data set where there were final cost estimates available, most of those began construction in that same year as that final cost estimate. Excuse me. Even more of them had begun project within a year. And so when you have a few projects that didn't begin construction until 2 and 3 years after the final cost estimate was prepared, those delays might be symptomatic of other planning problems. How long it took to build the project actually was a predictor of less accurate ridership forecasts and less accurate initial cost estimates, but for final cost estimates, the length of time it took to construct the project wasn't necessarily associated with a less accurate final cost estimate. And then total project costs. So this speaks to this idea of that larger projects might potentially be riskier or are subject to even greater errors, not just in terms of the total dollar value of the errors, but even like the percentage of the errors. This wasn't necessarily true for ridership forecasts, but was a little bit more true where we see less accurate both initial and final cost estimates for projects, for more costly projects on the cost side. And then project length, this is just project length in terms of number of miles. Again, testing this idea that larger, more ambitious projects have less accurate cost and ridership forecasts. The data don't really bear that out. None of these relationships are statistically significant. You have all these correlation values with confidence intervals that include 0. And then differences by mode. For initial cost estimates, there were no differences in accuracy by mode. But there were some modal differences for both the ridership estimates and the final cost estimates. For final cost estimates, the cost estimates for heavy rail projects had more error. And for ridership, there was more optimism for people movers, which are monorails. Relatively small sample of those as well. So that's some of that difference too. Speaking of how more unusual modes that are built less often, there might be more experience associated with forecasting for those. And so we do see this question of if a project was an initial line, like introduced a new mode to the region, compared to if it was an expansion of an existing line or if it was just renovating existing service. There was this theory that maybe that would be associated with, as you have more experience with the mode, you'd be able to forecast for it better, but there weren't any significant differences by sequence or by another way of conceptualizing that. How much of the resulting system does this project represent? But again, no statistically significances there as well. So summarizing these just simple correlations, what we end up seeing is for cost estimates, for initial cost estimates, they get better over time. So there's this positive correlation with year. That's true for ridership as well. The amount of time that it takes to build a project is associated with kind of less accuracy for both construction, both initial and ridership forecasts. For final cost estimates, it was more about how much more time is left to build the project, again, for the handful of projects that didn't begin construction right away. Total project cost is related to forecast accuracy for cost estimates, but not for ridership forecasts. And project length and mode, there wasn't much of a relationship. There wasn't a relationship for initial estimates, and for final cost estimates, there was just a little bit of a difference between heavy rail projects and light rail projects. And there wasn't much of a relationship for anything describing local experience. When we put these in a regression analysis, so look at the relationships between these things controlling for the other characteristics, we have even fewer significant relationships. Few of them even are at the 95% confidence level, but there are some differences by mode. But for cost estimate accuracy, the only thing that's significant at a 95% confidence level is, again, this difference between heavy rail projects and light rail projects. But the real highlight here is that the mechanisms seem to be different for ridership forecasts than for cost forecasts. So summing all of this up, some preliminary conclusions just based on this is that cost estimates, and especially the last cost estimate that's completed before project construction begins, have a better track record than ridership forecasts do. Cost estimate error is not strongly correlated or really seems to be correlated at all with ridership forecast error. Final cost estimate error is better, has less error than initial cost estimates, although there is some correlation between the two. And that the biggest predictor of which projects will have the greatest errors are the more costly projects, which is a problem because this is in terms of even percent error. And so that difference is magnified when you think about the more costly projects. A 5% error represents more dollars than for a less costly project. Questions that arise from this research. One would be if sort of the ethical explanations that seem to apply pretty well to the extent that there might be like some intentional misrepresentation that has happened for ridership forecasts, like to what degree that might be true for cost estimates. There's also this piece where this question of to the degree to which cost estimates may be self-fulfilling. So again, because the agency may have some control over how much money they spend building a project, even after they've prepared their cost estimate. If a cost estimate is quite high, does the project sort of expand to fill the budget that's available to it? And so is there some selection bias or some degree of like a self-fulfilling prophecy related to the cost estimate itself? There's a question of when cost escalates over the course of project development, does the federal funding share tend to change? So are agencies able to go back and ask for more federal money as a project starts to look more expensive, and in what situations that has been successful? And related to that is this last point, which is when does a project get abandoned? So looking at, again back at the quotations from the Robert Moses book, This idea that there's a strong incentive to initially underestimate costs because once the project is underway, it'll be harder and harder to cancel it. Is that true? Because it does happen occasionally that a project will enter the project development pipeline, specifically thinking about the New Starts projects funded by the FTA, and they ultimately costs sort of spin out of control and project gets canceled, or project is abandoned, or has to be rethought substantially to the point where it's a different project. What predicts whether we consider all those costs to be sunk costs and we abandon the project, and under what circumstances do we continue to push forward and throw good money after bad? And then also thinking more carefully about this relationship between cost escalation and cost overrun. Is one a predictor of the other? Does one make up for the other? Which of these two things is more of a concern for us? So these are all things that I want to continue to address as this research project continues. So with that, I'm happy to take questions, and I can stop sharing my screen, I think, at this point, so that I can.
Yes, that works well. And if there's a question about a specific slide, we can always bring it back. But thank you so much, Carol. That was a really fascinating presentation, and as you said, incredibly well related to our work, which focused more on just the final sticker price of projects. But we got into some of this question about estimates within the literature, about overruns versus escalation. So I just wanted to make sure that people are able to access the chat. I've seen that we've had some issues with people not being able to access the chat, at least on our end. I'm not able to see the questions in the back end, but I am able to log in as an attendee and see your questions. So I will incorporate those into my Q&A here. But if anyone is not able to access the chat or access the live stream, please let us know, and we can try to troubleshoot. But the recordings will be available in case you or anyone had issues accessing the live stream. It doesn't seem like that's the case here based on what I'm seeing in the chat, but we're sorry for any tech issues. But I'm going to go ahead and get started with, one of the questions that I had, as you were going through this presentation, and I've seen some comments in the chat here, going back to this point about biases and costs. We had a comment from David Cope who said, I found in my projects that officials and decision makers want to know the cost of projects and start reducing it even before it's fully scoped out, which prompts staff to try to portray the costs as lower and lower, and leading to surprise when the costs inevitably rise. And both of us, kind of ended with this question of, is there any way to help keep estimates on the more realistic end? This is not an easy question to answer, but what are there ways to institutionalize checks on these biases, whether that's a transparency or a process-related issue, to make the process of coming up with these initial forecasts a little bit more realistic?
I think one possible answer to that question would be something that I mentioned Bent Flobier briefly in my comments, and he's someone that has also spent a lot of time, particularly in the mega project space, which not all projects in this data set, I think, qualify as mega projects, although some might. And I'm not necessarily convinced that the mega project, the context of mega projects applies equally well to like a small bus rapid transit line as it does to some of these big projects. But in the mega project space, Bent Flobier has been a big advocate for reference class forecasting. And the specifics of that method, are one thing, but the general motivation behind it, I think, is a really good one. This idea of looking at similar projects where it's one thing to build a cost estimate from the ground up and say, this is how much land acquisition should cost, this is how much engineering should cost, this is how many days we think this will take, how many hours of work this will need, and sort of put those together into a total cost. Another way to come at least in the early stages of project, is to have those be grounded by other experiences, by other projects, which I think ties really well into the work that Eno has been doing. So to be able to draw on both international experience and other, so having a database of how much is there another project? If this is going to be a heavy rail line or a subway line or a light rail line, and we've never built those in our city before, what was the last time some other city that's kind of similar to ours, or a set of other cities that are comparable to ours, have built a light rail line. And if our estimate that we built from the ground up based on sort of, the price of labor and the price of the individual components is a tenth of, or half of, or only 2/3 of what anybody else has been able to complete this project for, that should raise some alarms. So I think being guided by the experience in other locations and and you might have a justification why, Kansas City is very, very different from New Mexico. And so our costs in Kansas City should be really different from what this experience was there. But you should at least be forced to answer for why your cost estimate is so much lower than similar projects in other places, which is really the question that in many ways motivated this larger project that just finished. Like, do we have a strong reason why, not just the final project cost, for the Second Avenue subway was so different from what's been experienced in Europe? You can ask that question at the cost estimate stage. What makes us think we can do this so much more cheaply than other places? There's that quotation, I think, from Anna Karenina about how all happy families are alike, but all unhappy families are unhappy for a different reason. Something along those lines. All cost overruns have their own unique, special story. All cost escalation, we have sometimes really incredible, like hard to believe, something that was found while we were excavating for this, or, this crazy lawsuit that we couldn't have anticipated, and who knew that citizens would organize in this way. But the fact that every project has this thing that happened, we need to be able to build this in. We don't know what this thing is that's going to go wrong, but given that every project that's been finished in the past 15 years has had some kind of thing that increased costs, we should build that into our cost estimates, which isn't a revolutionary thing. The idea of building in contingencies to a cost estimate, I don't think that's radical. But I think when there's pressure to continue to bring cost estimates down, that might be the place where there's some temptation to say, like, well, do we really need to be that conservative? Let's look at, what are the unexpected events that typically happen, and how can we just kind of incorporate some of that uncertainty into our cost estimates? But I think relying very heavily on the experience of other similar places. It gets trickier when we're building transit projects for modes that are brand new. So if no one's ever, so when we're talking, what's the right cost for, I don't know how much a Hyperloop will cost. But a lot of these technologies we're working with, especially if we're willing to draw on international experience, we may need to make adjustments. But starting with these comparison cases and adjusting it to match what we're experiencing locally, again, rather than sort of building all the pieces from the ground up and assuming that there's nothing to learn from the experience in other places.
That's a great point. And I have some questions too about this idea of having the contingencies in a broader cost envelope when you're preparing these estimates. But I know, getting at your last point in your slides, about future research, particularly this idea of whether these cost estimates are self-fulfilling. We had a question in the chat from Sandy Johnson, and something that I had flagged as well was, I'd love to hear your thoughts, just from your preliminary, I know you flagged this as a subject for future work, but to what extent, are our estimates self-fulfilling, and is it possible to take the opposite lesson from learning from other places? Why are our costs so high? And if we're using our already high baseline costs to check our estimates, to what extent can these estimates, reinforce one another and continue to inflate relative to other countries?
This is why I feel like studying
$1 million question
is so tricky, right? And I'm currently teaching these like research design classes to my master's students about like normative questions versus positive questions, right? So how much does something cost? We can figure that out. But like, how much should it cost? That's a really hard question to get at, particularly again. So all I'm really going to do is validate your question, but I think it's important to keep as top of mind when we look at, and there's probably folks in this room on this call who are like in transit agencies and embedded in this work to a much greater extent than I am, like sitting in my office in a university. But the times, drawing back to times when I was, working as a professional engineer, this idea that when you have a project budget, I'm being careful in the way I phrase this because it's unethical to like misclassify time to the wrong project. But like if you have an intern, like let's charge their time. We have excess budget here, and like we could charge their time to this project and get them working on this. And it does contribute. And like the ability to kind of move costs around to the project that has available budget, I think makes it incredibly tricky. To say what was the minimum project could have possibly cost? Like where do we allocate sort of soft costs and overhead? And there are accounting rules around that, but there's also sort of this ability to, if there's something nice you'd like to do, which project has budget to absorb that? There's this cost allocation piece of it that I think is tricky to get at just by looking through like accounting records, and I think that conversation needs to happen qualitatively and maybe sort of holistically. Like maybe we look at slates of projects that are kind of sharing resources in some ways. But I think the cost estimate, cost overrun piece is an important part of this question. This idea of looking kind of across countries, looking at kind of comparable costs, if there's some region that's able to truly, which we've seen that's even tricky to get at. Like, was it cheaper, or are they accounting differently? Yeah, I think all I can do is really acknowledge that's a tricky question, but I think that is a danger of reference class forecasting, is this idea that if there are inefficiencies, it bakes those inefficiencies in, right? And there's with the idea of maybe some degree of cost escalation and cost overruns is desirable to the extent that they anchor us at lower values. And maybe we will always have cost overruns in this type of setting, but the total cost will be lower than it would have been had we had a generous budget. We would always be within the budget, but we'll spend more than we otherwise would. I think it raises this question of if cost overruns are really the problem, and if like accepting some level of cost overrun would actually kind of, if budgets are sort of aspirational and we never quite make it, but that would keep total costs down. I think that's a really interesting question, and one that kind of requires us to have some idea about what the true, like real cost of a project should be. And it's something that feels like it should be knowable, but I don't think anyone's quite figured out how to define that. What's the real true number? Because I think that that's kind of a characteristic of planning any project. That will take as much, like a project will expand to take up all the time and budget available to it, and possibly and then some. Can we reduce costs by reducing budgets? How well does that work? I think those are good questions. I don't have a simple answer to that other than to acknowledge that we need to keep that question front of mind as we're researching these and related questions.
Yeah, your point about the accounting is very true, at least in our experience when we were putting the database together. We tried wherever possible to get the cost breakdowns, and from the FTA, and I know they're going through a process to update the capital cost database. But when you go beyond federally funded projects, it's every agency, every country accounts for things differently, and it's so hard to figure out what goes into that sticker price. And so, I think hopefully this conversation and the work of other researchers will be some kind of wake-up call to, I don't know how optimistic I am in terms of standardizing the reporting, at least within the United States, but having some standardized benchmark where the cost reporting is consistent. I have another question too on this idea of, you mentioned the FTA conducts some oversight, at least with the PMOCs, on how cost estimates are put together. And of course, we still struggle with the escalation and the estimation. As part of the second phase of this work, we're doing some more case studies into additional countries. And one interesting model we found was in Norway, where there was a series of cost escalation and overruns on public works projects. And so they really centralized the process by which projects go through this quality assurance. And so they have this network of pre-selected consultants, and every project over $100 million has to be vetted at the initial stage when you're developing the project scope, and then right before it gets approved by these independent consultants. And then all of this goes through parliamentary approval. And it's still too soon to tell how well it's working, but one of the papers I found evaluating the results said it was generally helped keep projects within the cost envelope, the contingency that they established for projects. And so I'm really curious, at least in your work, whether you identified opportunities to expand our oversight of the cost estimation process. There were some comments in the chat about when you come up with the estimate, it goes through so many layers of management and has to be vetted, and the estimates change. So do we have some kind of way to maybe add more transparency and consistency to this project, to this process?
I think it's a good question. The shortest answer would be like, I don't know. This is kind of a next stage of research for me, is getting more into how the processes work. Particularly because when I was looking at ridership and cost simultaneously, there's already so much more transparency and oversight over on the cost side than there is on the demand side. So I think that the shortest answer there might be, I think the process probably could be improved. I think there would be likely to be resistance because, again, there is this sense that every single location believes that it's very, very special. And even that's resistance to, you could require reference class forecasting, which I believe they do for large projects in the UK now, which is simpler and more transparent and kind of, but the resistance to that is that this idea, like, which projects are comparable to this one, and these outside consultants, they don't understand kind of our local condition. I think that argument holds up more on the ridership side because there are some kind of there's this cultural thing about who will ride transit. Then on the cost side, you can sort of account for local differences, like what are prevailing wage rates. And so I think there's room for more oversight and that piece, and the politics around how acceptable that would be, I think, would be really interesting. But I'll be watching for that next phase of your research as well, and see what you come up with there.
Yeah, again, it's such a good point, and the next phase again has to do with looking into different countries more at a broader level, and so I very much, I think, in one of our unanswered questions goes back to this point on accounting and standardization. How do you make sure that there's some realistic baseline when you're putting these estimates together? I know we said we were at the last question, but I see we have just a couple minutes left, so I am going to sneak in another one that I did want to ask and go back to this idea of ridership forecasting, again, something that our research did not touch, but one of our recommendations had to do with de-emphasizing the role of ridership in selecting projects and looking more at accessibility metrics. I know that's something the FTA is considering with the RFI that they put out recently on, what are some accessibility metrics in terms of access to jobs and recreation and services? How can we change the metrics that we use? And I know that, ridership is such a huge part of that score. And so I'd love to hear, from your research and your thoughts on, given how wildly, these estimates can fluctuate, are there better ways to maybe place ridership in a more appropriate context and bring in other metrics? And if so, what are those metrics and what should their appropriate weight be?
Ridership is a nice metric in the sense that it relates really well to all the other things that we claim transit can do. So if we say, but it's not just about who rides it, it's about economic development. Well, if transit is really developing the local economy, it should, you can talk about signaling effects and things like that, but it should be because people are riding transit to get to places. If transit is really, if it's really reducing traffic congestion, we should see that in ridership if a lot of people are abandoning their cars to ride transit. And so ridership is appealing in that way. A big problem with ridership, though, is that it's really hard to predict. And it's so easy to game that measure. I like the idea of an accessibility metric. So just based on where do people live now, what opportunities are there that they need to be connected to? And it becomes then a geometry problem rather than a problem of, pulling out your crystal ball and predicting the future. And so there's more transparency around it that way. It's a easier lift. It's also asking a really different question, though. By accessibility alone, you don't get credit in a way for things like if you feel really confident that you could attract more riders if only you had better amenities in your transit stations. That's something you don't get credit for. But I think that there's pretty good research at this point that suggests that the thing that transit riderships value is really frequent, really reliable transit service. And I think you could craft a good accessibility metrics that captures those things. So instead of measuring how many people are going to ride transit, which is, speaking of this idea of we view ridership as kind of beyond the transit agency's control, it kind of is in a lot of ways. I think that's why transit agencies don't like to be held too accountable for it. Like there's these outside economic forces that can affect things. But where a transit line is in relation to like existing land use, that's something that the transit agency can control. And I think gets to the heart of what matters to transit riders. And so I would favor a nice clean metric like that. That's just, but it changes our conception of, we have to have we can talk about what metrics easiest to calculate, what metrics easiest to predict. But in this perfect world, I would love if we had a metric where we have a really good conversation about what is it transit's supposed to do, and have a metric that measures that really well. And accessibility doesn't measure all the same things that ridership does, but I think it's worth having a conversation about the things that we value, the things that we care about. Does accessibility capture that maybe even better than ridership does? I think we can get to some questions around like equity maybe more effectively with an accessibility metric than we can with ridership. There's also this piece about, though, and I know we're over time at this point, but interpretability. There are some really elegant metrics you can have for the benefits of an existing or future transit project that really, are well grounded in economic theory, but are hard to explain at a public meeting about why this is going to be such a great project. Ridership is easy to understand. I think an accessibility metric would have to be carefully crafted to be as interpretable to stakeholders and constituents as ridership is. So even ridership, it's hard to understand how it's calculated, but it's easy to understand what it's supposed to be. I think that's a little bit of a weakness of, it's not insurmountable, but I think communicating what that metric means is going to be important as well.
Well, that is a great note to end on, and lots of fodder for future research on both of our ends. And I'm excited to see what you have in the pipeline in terms of more work on the next phase of what some of these considerations are on estimation. And again, the recordings for this session and the other ones will be posted on the back end. And if you have any questions or follow-ups, please reach out to us and we can make sure that we get your questions in the right hands. Well, Dr. Voulgaris, thank you again so much for sharing your time with us and sharing your presentation. It's incredibly relevant. And we look forward to staying in touch and hearing more about your work. And we'll be sure to exchange updates and with all of you as well in attendance. So thank you again all for joining, and enjoy the 30-minute break before our 1:30 session. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.